reading.
Senator Pate.
Thank you, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
Newly elected government promised to bring us together to uphold Canadian sovereignty and Canadian values with elbows up. To this end, we were advised that Part 2 of Bill C-5 is aimed at promoting national projects that build up Canada. Regrettably, the process thus far with this legislation has raised significant concern amongst Canadians. The rushed legislative process undertaken with respect to this bill raises the specter of expedited future projects being pre-approved with irreversible and generational consequences for health, communities, economies, and the environment over the protests of those most negatively affected, without adequate work to understand, much less obtain consent to, likely risks. Canadians see a risk that, rather than empowering all of us, Bill C-5 will hand unprecedented power to a few in Cabinet. Instead of bringing us together in the face of threats made by our neighbour to the south, it risks exacerbating inequality and division, emulating and reinforcing attempts to power grab. Indigenous leaders with decades of experience working to defend inherent rights of sovereignty and self-determination have been especially clear. Former Minister of Justice and Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould assessed the passage of Bill C-5 in the other place as follows, and I quote, "Today, Canada became weaker. Bill C-5 gives unchecked powers to a few officials, overrides laws of Parliament, and steamrolls constitutional rights. Our economy won't grow by creating conditions of uncertainty and conflict. Our sovereignty is not protected by being anti-democratic," end quote. Last week, National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepinak urged us, quote, "We know how it feels to have Trump at our borders. Let's not do that and have Trump-like policies with each other," end quote. Our late colleague, Senator Sinclair, challenged each of us and the nation of Canada with 4 questions. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Why are we here? And who are we? The Bill C-5 legislative process and approach to nation building shapes what Canada stands for and who we are. The amendments made so far to Bill C-5 provide some positive safeguards, but as acknowledged by MPs from every single party in the other place, they are not sufficient. C-5 still grants the government unfettered discretion to define, pre-approve, and designate national interest projects without first assessing their risks. The 5 factors that the government may use to determine national interest projects remain optional instead of mandatory. The amendment added to Section 5.1, and which requires governments to report on how projects will respond to these factors, crucially omits the requirement of the government to report on how projects will further the goals of clean growth and meeting Canada's obligations regarding climate change. Amendments now protect some legislation, such as the Indian Act, but Bill C-5 still mostly leaves in place the government's unchecked power to exclude or alter laws. The pace with which this bill has barreled through Parliament leaves significant concerns about democracy and respect for law and legal rights unanswered. National Chief Woodhouse Nepinak emphasized what this means for First Nations and ultimately for Canadians as a whole when she urged us to take time and do things properly. Take the summer to talk with each other, to work through and make the bill stronger and address the parts detrimental to the rights of First Nations people. She was clear in saying, and I quote, "Ramming something through in 7 or 14 days is not the Canadian way. All we ask is you follow your own rules, follow your own laws, and look at how far we have come. Let's not step years back and hurt that very delicate relationship that's now coming. People are trying to work on that together. First Nations are trying. This will impact them and their children and grandchildren ahead," end quote. First Nations interested in the potential economic opportunities provided by Bill C-5 have nevertheless been troubled to see it fast-tracked without meaningful consultation. The Assembly of First Nations has been clear that part of the meaningful work and consultation that the federal government must undertake with First Nations rights holders must involve, at a minimum, incorporation into Bill C-5 of the standard of free, prior, and informed consent required by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Act. At committee in the other place, an amendment to this effect was unfortunately defeated. While Minister LeBlanc has reiterated, including in his recent letter to us, that full consultation will take place, many remain concerned about what this will amount to in practice. As the AFN pointed out during Committee of the Whole, while the preamble of Bill C-5 speaks to the UN Declaration Act and the duty to consult as interpretive, there is no concrete inclusion in the bill of these standards, nor an operationalization of those standards, including free, prior, and informed consent. The to-be-created Indigenous Advisory Council is characterized as a response to the government's consultation obligations, yet we are provided no information about what the government actually intends and how it foresees meeting the standard of free, prior, and informed consent. AFN rightfully cautions that under Article 19 of the UN Declaration, an advisory council of government appointees, even if Indigenous, cannot constitute an entity with which the government can carry out consultation or obtain consent. As Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami President Nathan Obed reminded us, absent the clear incorporation of free, prior, and informed consent within Bill C-5, we risk falling further into the trap of paying only lip service to Indigenous rights. He testified to senators that, and I quote, "It has been Canada's weakness that it pats itself on the back for being a great champion of Indigenous peoples' rights, while at the same time acting very differently through its legislation and practices. I think of those things as being born out of not only ignorance, but also a clear decision about whose rights matter and whose don't, and how to get to an end goal that makes Canada feel good about itself while still trampling on the very rights it says it upholds," end quote. In the wake of inadequate consultation with respect to the bill, Indigenous peoples are understandably concerned by vague invocations of the UN Declaration when it comes to Bill C-5. Mere days after the speech from the throne reaffirmed that, quote, "as Canada moves forward with nation-building projects, the government will always be firmly guided by the principle of free, prior, and informed consent," end quote. The AFN reported that the Crown failed to meet its legal, constitutional, and international obligations for deep consultation and consent when it came to assessing Bill C-5's substantial risks to collective rights of First Nations. First Nations rights holders were instead given an unreasonably tiny window both before and after tabling, with much less engagement in substantive exchange of views, end quote. Indigenous peoples already disproportionately bear the burden of Canada's policies of irresponsible environmental degradation. Inadequate consultation with respect to Bill C-5 and the natural resource projects that it enables will only exacerbate this travesty. 34 First Nations lost any hope of having input on Bill C-5. Why? Because the entire time we have been considering Bill C-5, they have been fighting forest fires caused by human-induced climate change that threaten the lives and worlds of their peoples. Like the calls for justice of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, ITK President Obed reminded us that the negative effects of natural resource development within Indigenous communities include gender-based violence within natural resource development projects. There has been virtually no discussion of this dimension of Bill C-5. Jody Wilson-Raybould says, quote, "We need to be clear that this new economy is not going to be built on the backs of Indigenous peoples in their communities, and it's not going to be built on the lands that they have protected for generations," end quote. In the past, Canada has too often abdicated its responsibilities and relied on Indigenous peoples to challenge inadequate environmental standards and protect the air, land, and water on which we all rely. The costs for Indigenous peoples have included everything from litigation fees to criminalization for attempts to address Canada's failure to respect Indigenous laws and self-determination. Bill C-5 is generating the need for young Indigenous community leaders to once again prepare to challenge and therefore shoulder this unjust burden. Indigenous youth rallied against Bill C-5 on Parliament Hill at the beginning of what Ramon Katakapit, and I apologize if I've mispronounced because I undoubtedly have, a youth councillor with the Chiefs of Ontario and Anishinaabe Nation and a member of Attawapiskat First Nation in Northern Ontario, describes as a movement to protect their culture and lands. Tara Roy, another youth councillor with Chiefs of Ontario, recalling their mother taking them to Idle No More protests more than a decade ago, says, "It's frustrating that at 11 years old I was doing that, and now again at 23. If I'm tired of having to fight this again, I can only imagine how my grandmother feels." AFN also emphasizes that when it comes to nation-building projects, we want to talk about jobs, the economy, and growth, but that's not going to happen unless the infrastructure gap in First Nations communities is closed. Without action on clean water, on wastewater infrastructure and proper schools, First Nations will be left out from the one Canadian economy. AFN's proposals for clean water, housing, schools, and other essentials would be investments with significant positive impacts on the Canadian economy. Redressing these inequalities and legacies of colonialism should most definitely be part of nation building under Bill C-5. National Chief Woodhouse Nepinak spoke directly to us about our duties in the context of Bill C-5. She said, "I see the onus on all of you, the heavy lifting as you are sitting here trying to get through this. At the same time, I think there is a huge opportunity here to do things differently in this country, to work together and to come together. Let's get everybody to the table, the Prime Minister, the whole of Cabinet, Senators, and First Nations people. There are a lot of treaty people out there, people with inherent rights from coast to coast to coast, who want to come here and talk to you. You should hear from them. Give them that respect," end quote. Colleagues, if Bill C-5 is proposing to build Canada's next chapter, we can and must insist on a solid foundation. This means upholding principles of equality, justice, and democracy, protections for the air, land, and water that sustain all of us, and respect for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the inherent sovereignty and self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. In these times of urgent need for action, let us not fail. Miigwech, merci, thank you.